Fear is a companion that follows each of us every day and night. What would you do if fear stood between you and what mattered most in life? And who would you become if you let it win? This video is about more than adrenaline or heroic movie scenes, and it asks a quieter, harder question about what courage actually is in philosophical terms that matter for everyday life. We are going to move from ancient texts to modern psychology and end with practical steps you can use right now to meet fear with wisdom. The word courage comes from an old root tied to the heart as center and source of action and feeling in many ancient languages. Early philosophers imagined courage as something anchored in the center of a person, connecting feeling to action through an integrated will that cares about what matters. Understanding this etymology helps because courage was never merely physical strength or a reckless rush, and it was instead a form of alignment between conviction, emotion, and the capacity to act when consequences matter. That alignment is what philosophers and traditions have argued makes courage distinct and morally significant. Aristotle described courage as a mean between cowardice and recklessness that required reasoned judgment about danger and value. For him, courage was not the absence of fear, but the presence of a rational appraisal that led to the right action despite fear. This mean is moral and contextual, because what counts as courageous depends on what is worth risking, and Aristotle's insight helps us see courage as a practical virtue shaped by deliberation and habituation. Courage, for Aristotle, requires cultivated character, not random impulse or ignorant daring. The Stoics offered a different angle by defining courage as endurance in the face of pain and adversity, without being tossed by external events. Stoic courage emphasized inner stability and the ability to respond to suffering with calm purpose rather than frantic resistance. For Stoics, courage was bound up with self-mastery and the distinction between what we can control and what we cannot. And this distinction changes how we value fear and action. Learning Stoic courage can reframe fear as a signal to refocus on our sphere of influence rather than an enemy to be eliminated. In Eastern traditions like Confucianism, courage is often cast as a duty to moral order and communal harmony, rather than individual glory. Confucian courage depends on righteousness and the courage to uphold social obligations, even when doing so is personally costly or unpopular. Buddhist perspectives add another dimension by linking courage with compassion and fearlessness that dissolves attachments which cause suffering, and that fearlessness is cultivated through mindful awareness and the steady observation of the self. Courage in these contexts is relational, aimed at protecting the integrity of relationships and alleviating suffering, rather than showcasing personal valor. Existentialist thinkers reframed courage as authenticity and the willingness to create meaning in a meaningless world, making bravery a confrontation with existential dread and radical freedom. For thinkers like Kierkegaard and Sartre, courage meant owning one's freedom and acting despite absurdity and uncertainty rather than hiding behind social roles. This perspective makes courage personal and intensely psychological because it requires confronting anxiety about identity, mortality, and responsibility and choosing a path anyway. Existential courage is not about heroics in a crowd, but about integrity in solitude and decisions that define who we are. Across philosophical traditions, courage emerged as one of the cardinal virtues because it anchors practical life where values and risks meet each other. Being a cardinal virtue means courage supports other virtues like justice and temperance by enabling action in the world. This status explains why philosophers took courage so seriously. Without it, we cannot consistently act on our principles when cost appears, and the moral life deteriorates into talk without practice. Courage, therefore, becomes a hinge between moral reasoning and real-world behavior. Courage and fear are not opposites. They are partners in every brave act because fear signals danger and value simultaneously. Far from invalidating courage, fear often makes courageous acts meaningful by revealing what we care about and why we must act. This fundamental relationship reframes our work. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the capacity to engage with fear intelligently and purposefully. Recognizing fear as information allows us to transform it from immobilizing force into a motivating teacher for wise action. Modern psychology explains fear through brain circuits that evolved to detect threats, with the amygdala processing danger signals and the prefrontal cortex modulating responses. Fear is therefore both a rapid automatic reaction and a cognitive appraisal that can be reshaped by learning and reflection. This neuroscientific view is liberating because it reveals how courage can be trained by changing thought patterns and practicing different behavioral responses under stress. Knowing the mechanisms behind fear offers concrete leverage points for developing more intentional bravery in real situations. Recklessness looks like courage at first glance, but lacks the moral calculation that makes bravery meaningful and sustainable. Recklessness ignores context, disregards risk, or elevates impulsive daring above judgment, and it often harms oneself and others in the process. Courage, in contrast, requires calibrated risk-taking, informed judgment, and alignment with values, and ends that justify the risk. Distinguishing these two is vital because conflating them risks celebrating self-destructive acts as heroism. Moral courage involves standing up for what is right in social and ethical contexts, often at great personal cost and with uncertain outcomes. These acts can be anonymous and quiet or public and consequential, but they share a common thread of aligning action with deep moral conviction. Physical courage is more visible and often easier to narrate, yet moral courage can change institutions and lives over generations, making it perhaps the more consequential variety in democratic societies. Both require integration of feeling and reason, but moral courage often demands endurance in the face of social backlash. Civic courage shows up in whistleblowers, activists, and ordinary citizens who refuse to accept injustice for the sake of comfort or security. These examples expose systems and demand accountability, revealing how courage becomes a social corrective that protects the vulnerable. Such bravery costs careers, relationships, and sometimes liberty, and yet it is essential for the health of institutions and communities that aspire to justice and truth. Civic courage is thus an investment in collective life that requires moral imagination and resilience. The small, everyday acts of speaking up, setting boundaries, and making difficult appointments are the quiet training ground of courage that most people ignore. These micro-moments accumulate and form habits that reshape identity more reliably than dramatic acts of bravery. Practicing regular small risks helps desensitize fear and builds confidence in decision-making, turning timid persons into steady actors through repetition and reflection. If you want courage that lasts, start with tiny, consistent actions that test your edge just enough to grow. One practical method to develop courage is exposure therapy applied to daily fears in a graded and purposeful way that respects limits and builds tolerance. This deliberate practice means approaching discomfort incrementally, learning from each attempt and adjusting strategies with reflective feedback. Cognitive reframing complements exposure by changing the stories we tell about risk, turning catastrophic expectations into manageable possibilities that can be acted upon. Together, these tools help transform fear from paralyzing verdict into navigable signal. Stories and exemplars provide templates that help people visualize courage and imagine themselves acting in similar ways when danger appears. Narratives shape identity because we learn who to be by watching and emulating characters whose actions we admire and understand. This is why cultural heroes matter. They show the forms courage can take and offer rehearsals for moral imagination that can be internalized and repeated. Curating the right stories can therefore be a conscious practice in building courageous dispositions. Social support multiplies courage because facing fear is easier when others share risk and provide emotional backing and strategic help. Communities create safety nets that lower the individual cost of brave action and provide models for coordinated response under stress. This communal dimension explains why organized movements achieve what isolated individuals rarely can. and why institutions that foster trust can amplify courageous behavior across populations. Building courage individually, then, often requires cultivating relationships and reciprocal obligations. Emotions and reason are partners in courageous action, not adversaries that must fight for dominance in the mind. Practical wisdom, or phronesis, integrates feeling and thought so that decisions under fear are neither purely reactive nor coldly detached from human values. This philosophical insight matters because many misguided attempts at bravery fail when emotions are ignored or irrationally followed, and practical wisdom trains a person to read situations and choose the right kind of courage. Developing this capacity requires reflection, mentorship, and moral deliberation practiced in messy real-world contexts. Practical wisdom becomes a compass when fear clouds judgment and immediate reactions push for unsafe choices that appeal to short-term relief rather than long-term goods. Thinking in terms of ends and means helps avoid the trap of impulsive recklessness that masquerades as bravery. A useful exercise is to name the value at stake and imagine the costs of action versus inaction before taking the leap, because courage without a clear aim can become mere bravado. That framing helps align courage with enduring values and sustainable outcomes. Courage in the face of uncertainty means accepting that outcomes will never be guaranteed while still making morally necessary choices. Many important decisions require stepping into the unknown with imperfect information, and courage equips us to tolerate that necessary ambiguity. This acceptance is different from fatalism, because courageous action still involves prudential reasoning, contingency planning, and moral commitment even when the future is opaque. Learning to act under uncertainty is a core life skill that philosophy and practical training both emphasize. Training regimes to cultivate courage can be devised like athletic training with progressive stressors, debriefs, and mental conditioning to build tolerance and judgment. Simulation, role play, and controlled exposure allow safe rehearsal of scary scenarios that prepare people for real world stakes. This method is used in professional fields like medicine, the military, and emergency services because it reliably produces competent responses under pressure through repeated practice and reflective learning. You can borrow this structure for everyday fears by designing deliberate practice sessions tailored to your life. Measuring courage is difficult because outward acts can be deceptive, while inner intentions remain opaque to observers, and ethical evaluation must consider both behavior and motive. Some brave acts are performative, aimed at reputation rather than commitment. And these are not the same as courage properly understood. Evaluating courage therefore requires careful attention to costs borne, consistency over time, and alignment with genuine values rather than short-term gain. Philosophers and psychologists both remind us to look beyond spectacle to the scaffolding of character that supports real bravery. Failure is a common companion to attempts at courage and often serves as the primary teacher for deeper bravery because setbacks reveal hidden weaknesses and new strategies. Those who cultivate courage learn to fail publicly and privately, to process loss thoughtfully, and to return with refined judgment. This resilient mindset reframes failure as an investment rather than a verdict, and it makes future courageous actions more rooted in reality and humility. Learning from failure is therefore central to the long arc of becoming a braver person. Contemporary culture complicates courage because social media rewards spectacle and polarization encourages risky performative stances that look brave but are often hollow. The showy acts proliferated online can crowd out quieter, more consequential forms of courage that actually require sacrifice and discipline. Recognizing this distortion is necessary if we want to cultivate meaningful bravery in modern contexts, and it means valuing processes over headlines and endurance over applause. A discerning approach to cultural signals helps protect the integrity of courage as a virtue. Leaders require courage because organizations and institutions face moral crossroads that demand bold decisions despite resistance and short-term pain. Courageous leadership often involves choosing long-term institutional health over immediate popularity, and that requires resolve and ethical clarity. This kind of leadership is forged by practice and humility, and is amplified when leaders build cultures that reward speaking truth to power rather than feeding it. Leadership courage transforms not only individual choices, but the moral shape of entire communities. A philosophical twist emerges when we recognize that courage is intimately tied to our relationship with mortality and finitude, because facing death clarifies what is worth risking. Accepting life's limits can paradoxically make brave action easier by sharpening priorities and removing petty fears. This realization links ancient wisdom with modern therapy and existential thought, showing that courage is not arrogance in the face of death, but a sober appraisal of worth and consequence. Embracing this perspective supports a brave life that is meaningful precisely because it is finite. To act courageously in the moment, follow a simple practice: breathe to calm the immediate panic, name the fear to disarm its illusions, and identify the smallest effective action you can take. This triad creates space for deliberate choice and converts diffuse anxiety into targeted movement. Couple this with explicit commitment to values and a readiness to accept manageable costs, and you will find fear becomes less of a dictator and more of an advisor. Rehearsing this method in low-stakes situations prepares you for the more consequential times when courage matters most. Daily exercises to strengthen courage include short exposures, honest conversations, setting visible boundaries, and volunteering for responsibility that stretches capacity just slightly beyond comfort. These habits are small investments with compounding returns because they alter self-narratives and create evidence of competence that fear cannot easily erase. Keeping a journal of courageous attempts and their outcomes allows reflection that speeds growth and refines strategy over time, transforming random risk-taking into intentional development. The cumulative effect of these everyday practices is a durable increase in both confidence and moral clarity. Courage is also contagious because when one person acts bravely in defense of a principle, others often find permission to follow and risk alongside them. This contagious nature explains why movements can begin with one courageous act and grow into cultural shifts that recalibrate norms. This insight should encourage us to consider the systemic effects of personal bravery and to cultivate courage not only for private goods but for public transformation when needed. The ripple effects of one measured brave act can be profound and long-lasting. Philosophers remind us that courage without wisdom can be destructive, and wisdom without courage can be impotent in practice and effect. The partnership of insight and resolve is necessary for the moral life because it allows one to act rightly under pressure rather than merely knowing better from afar. Developing both capacities is a lifetime project that combines reading, mentoring, experience, and self-discipline in proportionate measures. If you want to live courageously over decades, commit to this integrated path instead of seeking quick fixes. When fear feels overwhelming, a grounding practice helps. Name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, and 3 things you are grateful for before choosing a next step. This sensory gratitude sequence reduces panic and reconnects you to the present moment where action is possible. Combining these grounding techniques with clear planning and support makes brave steps manageable, and it prevents reactive choices made under overwhelming emotion. Use this tool as a bridge between feeling and meaningful action when you need practical help fast. Consider a final practical framework. Define your values, map the smallest effective action, enlist one ally, and rehearse the action mentally before doing it in reality. This 4-step plan turns vague intentions into executable tasks that reduce the tyranny of fear by making the next step obvious and small. Repeating this process builds momentum because success breeds confidence and confidence fosters further courageous action, creating a virtuous spiral over time. Use this framework as a daily template for translating courage from idea into habit. The long view shows courage not as a fixed trait, but as a cultivated competence that deepens with practice, reflection, and community support over years. This perspective transforms disappointment into data and small wins into the scaffolding of a life shaped by intentional bravery. If you commit to learning courage rather than waiting to be heroic by accident, your choices will change in ways that ripple through your relationships, work, and society. The philosophical art of courage is therefore a practical project open to anyone willing to begin. The modern relevance of philosophical courage is urgent because our age confronts structural threats, moral dilemmas, and rapid change that require steady, wise responses more than flashy opinions. Courage today means choosing truth over comfort, duty over convenience, and long-term health over immediate advantage in a world wired for distraction. These are not new requirements, but intensified versions of perennial truths that philosophers have taught for millennia. Learning how to face fear with wisdom is therefore both ancient and urgently contemporary, demanding our attention and practice now. If this exploration gave you a new way to think about fear and courage, then the real work is to try one small practice this week and see what changes. Courage is practical and accumulative, so choose one measurable action, commit to it publicly or with an ally, and report back to yourself honestly. If this perspective resonated with you, hit subscribe to keep learning about how philosophy can change daily life, and share this with someone who might need a reason to begin. Thank you for watching and practicing. And remember that bravery is not an absence, but an art that can be learned.